Digital audio. It's it's hard to say it's new at this point. It's been out for quite a few years now. This mixer back here is an analog mixer. Everything about it is analog. So when your electrical impulses from your microphone come into it, it stays electrical impulses all the way through to the amplifier, to the speaker, and then the speaker turns those electrical impulses back into acoustic sound. But with digital, which is what we're running right now, so what I'm coming through right now is going to a soundboard at the back. How it's getting there is this is a wireless mic, so we've got acoustic energy turning into electrical energy, being turned into radio, RF, going to a receiver over there, which is then plugged into a stage box. That has a D to A converter, A to D converter. It's going from analog voltage to a digital signal. It's making a digital representation of the sound. It runs all ones and zeros through everything. And then once it goes out of the soundboard, it gets turned back into electrical and then acoustic. So there's an extra sort of phase change in there. So yeah, most audio in a sound system starts and ends its journey as sound waves. So you sing into a mic, you got your acoustic energy, and it comes out of the speakers as acoustic energy. So an audio spends most of its time as an electrical signal. So it's out of the microphone and then out to the amp before the speaker. That's all electrical. But that's either done as an analog waveform or as a digital representation of that analog waveform. So in digital audio, the electronic signal goes from the preamp, which is what your gain controls, to an analog to digital converter, then usually leaves the console via a digital to analog converter. So it switches it back and forth. So we call that an A to D, D to A. Two important numbers. If you're looking into like digital soundboards, it'll often tell you the sample rate and the bit depth. You're at the tab, right? Do you know what those numbers are on your board? That's okay, I'll tell you. So the first one is sample rate. So sample rate is how often per second in hertz the audio signal is sampled. Because when you're going from analog to digital, it's taking the analog electrical waveform and summing it, or coming up with a approximation using ones and zeros of digital information. The higher the sample rate, the more accurate the audio. And that's what this graph here is showing. So on the A1, that sine wave there is our electrical signal. It's got a very, very low sample rate. So it's taking a sample there, and there, and then just connecting the dots. And so you can see it doesn't match the waveform because the sample rate's too low. So that's going to sound wonky. This one has a higher sample rate, and it's taking it in multiple spots, and then by just connecting those dots, it's able to sort of give you a better approximation of the actual electrical signal. In this case, there would actually be a lot more dots, but and then there's kind of an interesting rule. The highest frequency that can be reproduced is half the sample rate. I'm not 100% sure on why, but it's a rule. It's just how the physics of it work. It's called the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem. There's probably a white paper on it somewhere. But if you had a CD, those were run at 44.1 kilohertz sample rate, which means the highest frequency you can reproduce is 22.05 kilohertz, which is above human hearing. So that was why they picked that. The smaller that number, the less data it is. And so that's about the smallest you can go without losing frequencies. The other number that's important is your bit depth. So it's the number of different signal levels that can be encoded as numbers, or how much data can be stored per sample. So wherever it's taking that sample, it's how much how big of a number can you go. So you can have like 8, 16, 24, there's 32-bit, and then you can get into floating point stuff. That's not important. And whatever bit depth you have, it's 2 to that power is how many numbers you can have to describe mathematically what that level is. So with 16-bit audio, there's 65,535 points that it can measure on like up and down, which gives you a 96 dB of dynamic range. There's going to be some rounding, and that's called quantization. So here's our bit depth. So there's our signal, and then with a lower bit depth, it's going to just find the closest line at where that signal is at, and that'll tell it how loud it is. And then it's just basically using math. It's binary. So this point down here is all zeros. And then it would be like 0, 1, or 0, 0, 0, 1, and then 0, 0, 1, 1. And then like it's how high can it go. So this is a higher bit depth number. So you can see it can give you a more accurate to the signal there. So the higher your sample rate, the higher your bit depth, the more accurate the digital conversion is, but the more data there is. And so here they are together. So here we have 16-bit audio with a 44 kilohertz sample rate. There's the actual signal, and this is the digital representation. As you can see, as these numbers go up, those squares just get smaller, so it can get more accurate to the waveform. So the SQ series that we use, it's a 24-bit 96 kilohertz console, which means it can reproduce signals up to 48 kilohertz, which is way beyond human hearing. There's some benefits to that. Some people tell you that it's completely pointless. But one of the things that it does is also the faster your sample rate, when you get into digital, you have to worry about latency. The faster your sample rate, the lower your latency is. And if you ever used a DAW and you've been trying to deal with latency, one of the ways to do is just turn your sample rate up, because it's taking samples faster, so you get faster information. And so on recording stuff, you can go up to like 192 kilohertz instead of 44.1 or 48. Most video is 48, CDs are 44.1. Those are the two important numbers.
Why wouldn't you just run it at the maximum setting all the time?
Well, it depends on, so why wouldn't you use it all the time at the highest setting? You can, but like if you're recording, when you double your sample rate, you're taking twice as much data. So if you had a 10 meg sound file, it's now a 20 meg sound file for the same amount of time. And that number can get pretty big if you're recording a lot of stuff for longer amounts of time. Same thing happens with your bit depth. The higher your bit depth goes, there's an equation that uses bit depth and sample rate, and you can figure out how much data you're going to be producing. So there's that. Sometimes it's just working with things. So our soundboard runs at 96 kilohertz, but some of the things I have attached to it can only run at 48. So our system runs at 48. The soundboard actually converts when it goes in and out of the soundboard. So, any other questions on that? There's just there was some good information on how the digital soundboard is actually working, because it's converting to these ones and zeros. And that's what, when a lot of digital boards use dBFS, full scale, so 0 is the top. And what that's saying is, if you go above 0, it's run, oops, wrong button. It's run out of math. It can't express that as a number anymore, because the signal is above that, its range. And so what it's technically doing is, for microseconds at a time, it's muting and unmuting the signal, and so that's why you get that sound.
If a church is looking for a sound system, do you recommend digital?
Yeah, generally, there's a bunch of benefits to digital, and then the price is just it's not much more, and you get a lot more out of it. So with analog, even a smaller analog board, often you get gain, EQ, and some aux sends and faders. That's it. So if you want to use reverb or compression or gating, you have to buy those. So yes, an analog board of a certain size will be cheaper than a digital board, but you'll have a lot less channels and you won't have any extra things that you'd have to buy those separately anyway, and it ends up costing more in the long run. Then there's some extra benefits with digital. You can save scenes, so you can, what I do, and it's not going to be on here because I made a new show for this thing. I save a scene that has, everything's just named, and I've got like a basic mix and all the monitors and all the faders are at 0. So I like having people practice, and that's how you get better at it. So I don't want to have, you know, all the EQs saved. So that's my preference and how I run my team and train them. So then every time they go up, they load the start scene, everything's down at 0. They go through, set the gain, do the EQ, or bring the faders up, do the EQ, all that sort of stuff. So they get reps. But another option is to sort of save like a base level scene with everything sort of in place, and you can just bring the faders up and go, and then make adjustments. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you can even get down to granular levels. Instead of saving the whole scene, a scene would be every single channel. You can save EQs or compression settings, or just like whole channel settings for one channel. And so you can, yeah, if you have your pastor, he speaks almost every Sunday. Generally, he's going to be in the same ballpark every time, so you don't need to change it. Yeah. Yeah, so that's another way you can go too, save a scene for each of them. It just depends on how much time you have, how much you want to get into it, that type of thing. I have a scene saved for each worship team, but I actually use it as my just safety between practice and Sunday, or in our case, Monday and Tuesday. So we load the start scene, build our mix, and then I save it to that team. So if anything changes between now and when they go, I can reload to the last thing that we saved. But generally, we're making adjustments even the morning of, because as much as it's the same team and they're playing the same instruments, those guitar strings are now a little bit older, and it's colder, so he's not hitting as hard because his fingers hurt, or they have a little bit of a cold coming on now that they didn't have 3 days ago. So everyone's going to sing a bit different, play a bit differently each time they play. So even with a saved scene, it's usually just a good starting point. And you can choose wherever that starting point is, but you need to go from there because it's always going to be different every time. Anything else? Make sense? Okay, network audio is another part of digital audio. So back in olden times, Lewis, yeah, when we were running soundboards like this, analog, like I said, with digital, we're just converting, so there's an extra step in there. But if we go back to analog, it's copper. You're running copper from your source all the way to the soundboard. How it gets there will differ depending on how you're set up, but like I have a snake here. So there's the head. So we can plug into here. It runs up to that stage box over there. In the past, when we were running analog here, there's stage boxes built in. One's over there, and one's on that side over there. And that's for each individual input there. There's 3 copper lines in each insulated from each other, and then insulated from all the other ones, running up into the ceiling, across, and then the attic, and then into where our tech booth used to be. Unfortunately, it was too short when we dropped the tech booth, so now it's just sitting up in the attic. But we're turning acoustic energy into electric energy, and then we need to transport that. And so they used to just use copper the whole way. With digital audio, you could run an analog snake. We could use that snake, plug it right into the back of the board. Most of them have local I/O is the term for it. So it's like this one has plugins on the back this board back there also has plugins on the back, and you can run copper all the way to there, and then the preamp and the D to A to D conversion happens up there. The other option is you can get digital snakes, in which case the preamp is now on the stage or just off the stage, and our copper line is just the mic cable. It runs into there. That converts it to our digital audio, and then how you transport that is when we get into networked audio. So there's three main sort of protocols you'll run into. One is console specific. So if you buy an Allen & Heath soundboard, you buy an Allen & Heath digital snake, grab a network cable, you plug the two together. Depending on which board you have, with Allen & Heath, it'll be S-Link, Giga Ace, D-Snake. Behringer uses AES-50, and Soundcraft actually uses MADI, which is a bigger protocol that's more in the broadcast world. But they're not really a network protocol, but they use Ethernet cable. It's meant to be a direct connection. So on the back of our soundboard, there's actually an Ethernet jack that says S-Link. And if we bought an S-Link stage box from Allen & Heath, you'd run a network cable from that one and plug it into there. And then that's how it does its, it transmits the information. And it's the same with the other consoles. They're not interchangeable. So if you have Behringer X32 or Midas M32, and someone gives you an Allen & Heath AB168, they'll both have network jacks, but they won't know how to talk to each other using different protocols. It's all coded differently. Anyone here using digital snakes? Sometimes you can get adapters to switch between them, but we'll get into that too. You're probably using a digital snake. Yeah. Yours was a new install. I'm pretty sure they are. So you guys don't know? Or do you know, is anyone using analog? They know for sure? Like they're using an actual copper snake that runs all the way back? Okay. So, yeah, you run into console specific. It's usually the easiest way because it's just plug and play. They're designed to work with each other. Then you just have to patch it. Can you switch to my thing here again? So this is a patch on the patch panel for our mixer. So this is how you connect, I plug into input 1 and I want it to come into input 1 or fader 1 or channel 1. You would, if we were going copper, so from here straight into the back, you use this local. So we go input, local, I'd hit where it says kick in, I'd hit number 1 and it would light up. And you can create a little, it usually creates a little line. You can see there's S-Link, which we don't use here, but that's where if you were using the digital snake instead of the local inputs on the back of the board, you would use this S-Link one and you would tell it, okay, these are my channels on my board and these are where the inputs, which input it is and where I want that to connect. Okay, back to the slide. So the sort of next one you can sometimes run into, it's a little bit more rare. It's called AVB, audio video bridging. Here's some numbers about it. It's not super important. This one's mainly used by Presonus as their digital transport system, which is what this board, this is a soundboard down here with no faders. It runs off iPad only. This one, if I wanted to, I could buy, sorry, it's hard to see, but I could buy a stage, a separate snake for it, and it would communicate through AVB. Oh, there we go. So that one down there, that's our mixer for our portable system. It requires specific network switches to work. They have to be enabled for AVB. Usually makes them way more expensive. It's a layer 2 protocol. If you're a computer nerd, you'll sort of understand what that means. It's just when networked information is transferred, there's 7 layers. It's the OSI model, and it uses the second layer. So it communicates by MAC address instead of IP. So a MAC address is a hard-coded address built into the equipment, where IP can be changed. This is my favorite one. There's 3 levels of Dante training you can take. I have all 3. It's free if you ever want to learn more about this stuff. It operates over TCP networks using, if you use the gigabit Ethernet switch, it can transport 1,024 channels of 48 kilohertz 24-bit audio, or an HDMI video signal with 8 audio channels, depending on how you set that up. It's actually the built-in one with Yamaha. If you buy any Yamaha digital soundboards, they use Dante as their protocol. Doesn't require specific networks, switches, and this one's a layer 3 protocol, so it uses IP addresses to make its connections. Either of them will work, AVB or Dante. I prefer Dante, it's more interchangeable. So, I can't remember, oh yeah. So with Dante, we actually run Dante here. That's one way to communicate between different brands. Because for most digital audio equipment, they make a Dante card for it or a Dante version of it, and then you can make them talk to each other. Because it's the communication layer for these products. So our soundboard at the back, there's an expansion slot where you can buy cards to add capabilities to the board. The one we bought is a Dante card. And then our stage boxes are actually the Dante variant of the stage boxes. So our stage box, instead of being a direct connection over S-Link to our board, is actually connected to our network switch. And our soundboard is also connected to the network switch. And then there's a piece of software I can open up, and I can make those connections in there. And the benefit of it is, unlike the S-Link GigaAce, which is a direct connection, this allows me to send it anywhere. I don't have the music channel on there. We have, so I don't know if you've ever been in our atrium during the day, we have some background music that's playing in there. That's actually, there's a player that we bought. It's sitting in the basement of the music building. It's plugged into our audio matrix for the whole campus. And then it uses Dante to transmit the audio through our network switches to an amp that's sitting behind Lydia's desk in the cabinet. And if I wanted to, I could send the audio that gets picked up by the microphone that we use for Zoom in the classrooms. That audio I could pipe through our speakers here if I wanted to. You just have to make the connections. So it's a lot more flexible. One of the ways we use it, so like I said, the audio goes into there, does an A to D conversion, hits the network switch, gets patched into our soundboard. It also gets sent to the old mail room. I don't know if you guys know where that is. We've turned that into a studio, and I have a TV and a computer with a little mixer board. And so a copy of the audio is sent both to our mixer and to there, and then we have someone sitting in there with studio monitors mixing the live stream. But all it took was just adding the computer, and then I could make that connection because it's running on Dante. You can set that, and it's dependent. So you have to figure out how much delay. The less switch hops you do, the lower the delay. On a gigabit network switch, what you do with Dante is you actually tell it what its latency will be, so that if something ends up getting there earlier, it just slows it so that everything comes in at the same time. And there's things in the software that'll tell you what to do, but the fastest I've seen, so for our soundboard to talk to that, is 250 microseconds. So that's 0.25 milliseconds. You can bump that up to like a millisecond if you want for more like safety, depending on how much sort of network usage or how many switch hops you're doing. But a good example of it, it's kind of hard to see here. We can look at it afterwards, but I wanted to add more in-ear systems here. And I'm out of outputs, like physical XLR outputs. So instead of buying a very expensive digital snake that I didn't need the inputs from, I just need some outputs, I was able to find a box through my integrator. He actually helped me find it. That is a headphone amplifier. So you just plug wires into it and you can do wired in-ears. But it inputs on Dante. So I didn't need any extra XLRs. I just dropped that in, hooked it into the network, patched the buses from our board to that, and now I have 9 in-ear mixes instead of 5. So, and it's a completely different, the brand of that box is Clang. It's part of a completely different system that we don't have, but we just needed the output side of it. And because it talked to Dante, between the brands, I can just connect them.